Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, Chapter 4, The Fixed. In this chapter, Dillard is going to explore the concept of the fixed, something that seems to be frozen in place. This chapter is in some ways a counterpoint to the enthusiasm she's been showing so far. She reacts to the natural world with wonder and awe and excitement, enjoying the examination of each minute feature, celebrating the fact that her eyes can see so much, and lamenting the fact that her human limitations don't allow her to take in even more of the universe. In the last chapter, we noted how that even winter, which we normally associate with coldness and death, she sees as full of life and vitality, patiently waiting for the arrival of spring. And yet, as we get into chapter 4, her tone shifts some. She gets into the world of insects and bugs in this chapter, and returns also to the image of the shadow, something she introduced in the Seeing chapter. The majority of this chapter is structured around her taking walks throughout her day, opening with a walk that leads her to discover mantis egg cases, and closing with a walk in the cold evening looking at the moon. The discovery of the mantis egg cases leads her to reflect on the life cycle of mantises, and also leads her to remember a particular childhood experience with a polyphemus moth cocoon. The middle of the chapter shows her wondering at shadows and insects, and being filled with a bit of doubt. Is there really meaning behind all of this? Do these patterns within the natural world show a higher sense of beauty and purpose? Or is it simply a representation of us being frozen and trapped within an endless loop? Her stories of the mantises and the polyphemus moth are punctuated by a particular image, the image of the mason jar. Within her childhood classroom, she saw a mantis egg case open up inside of a mason jar. With nowhere to go, the mantis nymphs wound up battling and eating each other, down to the last two, which finally killed each other in their struggle. Later, the polyphemus moth was also in a mason jar, and as the children's handling of it began to wake it up and cause it to open up and crawl out of its cocoon, the moth remained within the mason jar, unable to spread and dry its wings, ultimately ending up in a horribly deformed mass. The most haunting part of this story for Dillard is after the teacher released the moth, Dillard watched it during her recess crawl down the driveway. In her mind, it seems to be forever crawling. This mason jar is a kind of containment. And as she looks at the world of bugs, she feels a kind of horror in the way that they are in countless horrifying forms, and yet trapped within cycles of their life. The cycle of the mantis, where the female eats the male during mating. Or the story she describes about the pine Precessionaries, caterpillars that follow each other on a thread. In this particular instance, the pine Precessionaries have gone around the edge of a vase and have trapped themselves in an endless loop. Even though food is nearby, even though they're in desperate need of shelter and warmth, they continue to follow the same path around and around and around in a circle for 7 days, unable to break the cycle. At the end of part 1 of the chapter, Dillard draws her thoughts back to the idea of shadows. In the second chapter, Seeing, she connected shadow to making something real. Those who had recently had cataract surgery and were able to see for the first time described the world as having dark patches, not understanding that shadows define shape. She says on page 63, "So shadows define the real. If I no longer see shadows as dark marks, as do the newly sighted, then I see them as making some sort of sense of the light. They give the light distance, they put it in its place. They inform my eyes of my location here, here, O Israel, here in the world's flawed sculpture, here in the flickering shade of the nothingness between me and the light." And so, sometimes staring into the darkness is what helps us to understand the real, but sometimes it haunts Dillard, and she sees a world of shadow underneath our world. Underneath Tinker Creek is Shadow Creek, reflecting back the darkness that we try to avoid seeing. In part 2, she begins again to describe the horror of the bug world. But on page 65, she says, "The remarkable thing about the world of insects, however, is precisely that there is no veil cast over these horrors. These are mysteries performed in broad daylight for our very eyes. We can see every detail, and yet they are still mysteries. If, as Heraclitus suggests, God, like an oracle, neither declares nor hides, but sets forth by signs, then clearly I had better be scrying the signs. The earth devotes an overwhelming proportion of its energy to these buzzings and leaps in the grass, to these brittle gnawings and crawlings about. Theirs is the biggest wedge of the pie. Why? I ought to keep a giant water bug in an aquarium on my dresser so I can think about it. We have brass candlesticks in our house now. We ought to display praying mantises in our churches. Why do we turn from the insects in loathing? Our competitors are not only cold-blooded and green and yellow-blooded, but they are also cased in a clacking horn. They lack the grace to go about as we do, soft side out, to the wind and thorns. They have rigid eyes and brains strung down their backs. But they make up the bulk of our comrades at life, so I look at them for a glimmer of companionship. She then describes a grasshopper landing on her window. As she looks at it, she feels its foreignness, feels the strangeness of its feet, of its mouth, of its eyes, but then she sees it breathe, and it opens a path of sympathy for her. "Yeah," I said, "puff, puff, isn't it?" It jerked away with a buzz like a rasping file, audible through the pane, and continued to puff in the grass. So puff it is, and that's all there is. And yet the feeling of the fixed is difficult to shake. She says on page 69, "It is the fixed that horrifies us, the fixed that assails us with the tremendous force of its mindlessness. The fixed is a mason jar, and we can't beat it open. The prophets of Baal gashed themselves with knives and lancets, and the wood stayed wood. The fixed is a world without fire, dead flint, dead tinder, and nowhere a spark. It is motion without direction, force without power, the aimless procession of caterpillars round the rim of a vase, and I hate it, because at any moment I myself might step to that charmed and glistening thread. Last spring in the flood I saw a brown cattail bob in the high, muddy water of Carvin's Creek, up and down, side to side, a jerk a second. I went back the next day, and nothing had changed, that empty, twitching beat on an endless, sickening tattoo. What geomancy reads, what the wind-blown sand writes on the desert rock. I read there that all things live by a generous power and dance to a mighty tune, or I read there that all things are scattered and hurled, that our every arabesque and grand jeté is a frantic variation on our one free fall. The image of fall is going to be important in part 2, so remember this section. She describes both looking at the creek with a kind of horror, feeling that frozenness, but also sometimes feeling the vitality. Shadow itself may resolve into beauty, she says. She closes with her second walk. And though she feels nearly frozen, it is so very cold out, she does see the light of the moon and remembers a story about Kepler, who felt warmth from the moon. So even though she can't feel it, there is a kind of warmth in that cold light, reminding her that there's a beauty beneath what appears to be fixed and frozen. Next time, in Chapter 5, she's going to explore the change in seasons and return to some of her enthusiasm. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.